A Twisting Blades build is by far the most popular build choice for rogues in Diablo 4, but what if I told you that I have a special Flurry build that isn't only viable, but also rivals those popular Twisting Blade builds with both high DPS and survivability? This is a rogue build you don't want to miss, so here is the Imbued Flurry Rogue in Diablo 4. We are going to start where every build does, with our skill tree, focusing on our main skills first. For our basic skill, we will use Fundamental Puncture. This causes us to throw 3 blades in a cone and make enemies vulnerable, which is a core mechanic to this build. Next up is Flurry, which we want to fully upgrade as this is a Flurry build after all. You'll also want to unlock Improved Flurry. This means if we hit an already vulnerable enemy with Flurry, any other enemies hit by Flurry also become vulnerable, basically spreading the vulnerability from our puncture hits like a virus. Our third skill is countering Poison Trap. This gives us a small chance to reset imbuement skill cooldowns when activated. Additionally, Enhanced Poison Trap knocks down enemies for a short time, giving us some extra crowd control. And speaking of imbuements, we are going to run 2 of them. The first is Blended Poison Imbuement. This causes a large increase in poison damage when hitting a critical strike with poison imbued skills. Our second imbuement skill is Mixed Cold Imbuement, which freezes and chills enemies, but also gives us bonus damage against enemies crowd controlled by our poison traps and frozen enemies. For our ultimate skill, we are choosing Shadow Clone. This skill creates a shadow that mimics your actions for 15 seconds. On its own, this skill is okay, dealing 80% of the damage you deal. However, there is a specific aspect that makes this a must-have in this build, but we will get to the aspects in a little bit. Finally, for our key passive, we like Close Quarters Combat, which gives us increased attack speed for damaging close enemies with Marksman or Cutthroat skills. Going back to the start of our build, Puncture is a marksman skill and Flurry is Cutthroat, so we will be proccing this all the time. Quickly going through our passive nodes, we have Sturdy, which adds some close damage reduction, great for when we are crowded by enemies. Weapon Mastery, which increases our damage dealt depending on the weapon type we use. For this build, it will mostly be daggers and swords. Malice, which is another increase to damage against vulnerable enemies. Precision Imbuement increases our critical strike chance when using our imbued skills, which will be most of the time. Debilitating Toxins is great as we will be poisoning large groups of enemies with our imbuement and traps. This passive decreases the damage taken from those poisoned enemies. Frigid Finesse pairs nicely with our Cold Imbuement, again increasing the damage against chilled and frozen enemies. In our final cluster, we have Innervation, Aftermath, and Adrenaline Rush that all focus around regaining energy so we can keep spamming our skills. And our last passive node for good measure is Trap Mastery, adding more critical strike chance against vulnerable enemies after a poison trap activates. For the rogue specialization, honestly any of these will work for this build, so feel free to adjust based on your playstyle, but we recommend combo points as proccing this on Flurry leads to some huge damage numbers, especially if you can hit a critical strike on top of this. There are 3 aspects required for this build. The first is the aspect of Encircling Blades. This causes Flurry to attack all around you rather than in a cone in the direction you are facing. Now you'll be able to not only hit enemies directly in front of you, but all around you, which is especially helpful when you are surrounded. The second is the aspect of Unstable Imbuements. Whenever you cast an imbuable skill, you trigger an imbued explosion around yourself, dealing damage and imbuement effects to the enemies in its radius, once again great for when you're surrounded. Our final required aspect is the aspect of Imitated Imbuement. This causes your Shadow Clone to mimic your imbuement skills and increases its damage while active, and is the entire reason why we run Shadow Clone on this build. The rest of the aspects are up to you and your playstyle, but we recommend some defensive aspects like the aspect of the Protector, aspect of Might, or aspect of Disobedience. Other aspects that work really well include the Windstriker aspect that increases critical strike chance and movement speed, aspect of Smiting that increases critical strike chance and crowd control duration, as well as the Umbral aspect that increases energy restoration for crowd controlling enemies. A quick review of our core stats show an obvious focus on dexterity. We don't necessarily care about the increased dodge chance, but the increase to skill damage is a huge buff for this build that helps pop even the strongest enemies with our Flurry Puncture spam. Our next focus is intelligence. This core stat gives us resistance to all elements, but more importantly, increases our critical strike chance, which if you haven't figured out at this point, is one of the main stats for this build, especially when applied against vulnerable enemies. Our final focus is strength, which gives us energy regeneration and increased armor. Both of these are great for this build as we will be spamming skills and need the energy regeneration, and we will often find ourselves in the middle of large groups of enemies, so the armor is very helpful. Willpower isn't much of a focus for this build, however if you find yourself struggling with your healing received, you may want to add some Paragon points here. With our rogue build setup extensively covered, it's time to see what kind of damage we can do. These next clips are from a Whispers dungeon on World Tier 3. The strategy to this build is simple because we essentially follow the same opening combo in every situation. Open alternating between Puncture and Flurry, quickly spreading vulnerability to any enemy on screen. Follow that up with a Cold Imbued Flurry to freeze enemies, then a Poison Imbued Flurry that should shatter most enemies and poison anything that somehow survives this initial attack. Also, don't be afraid to use your evade in an aggressive fashion to close distance on any stragglers or to transfer imbuement and vulnerability damage to multiple groups of enemies with just one cast. In situations against multiple elites or larger enemies, don't forget to use your Shadow Clone ultimate before using your imbuements. Since your Shadow Clone mimics your imbuements, you can do double the freeze and poison across double the area in the same amount of time. So we have established that our imbue skills are used in conjunction to clear crowds of enemies in an instance. However, even when these skills are on cooldown, the crowds have no chance. A well-placed poison trap because of our enhancement will knock everyone down, making them all free kills. And finally, let's finish on a boss fight to truly show the power of this build, but don't blink because you might miss it. The tactics of this build are easy to master no matter who or how many enemies you are facing. If you can get them grouped up, you'll delete them in seconds by spamming your abilities. So that is our Imbued Flurry Rogue build. It might not be as popular as Twisting Blades, but it is clearly just as viable. And for more Diablo 4, keep it locked here on IGN.